So this Microsoft Activision Blizzard deal is basically going through, and I feel like there's been a lot of talk about if it'll go through and like what the sort of ramifications of it. But I feel like there hasn't been much conversation on why Microsoft thinks that like Activision Blizzard is worth $70 billion, which is kind of insane. Like, you compare that to other things that have happened where, like, yeah, you can understand why that valuation is the way that it is and why they think this deal is worth doing. Like, for comparison, look what happened with, Lucasfilms. Like, that was $4 billion, way less money. Basically immediately made a third of that back with the first Star Wars movie. Didn't make as much with the other ones, but still, with the money from that, plus merchandise, plus games, and the fact that, the shows are like the big thing keeping Disney Plus going. Or one of the big things, at least. I don't have the numbers in front of me, I don't think they exist publicly, but it kind of seems like they got the value of that back. Maybe not like for profit, but considering things like, who knows what state Disney Plus would be in without the Star Wars shows. It's already not great now. They probably got their money's worth. Back to video game. Insomniac, and they were mainly making Sony exclusives, but they also made other stuff, like an Xbox exclusive, so it's kind of locking them down. Did have value, plus, whatever profit for the previous owner. Bungie was kind of a similar situation where I don't think Bungie's games are really going to be making like $3 billion anytime soon. But there is the additional value of, Sony's trying to get into live services. Bungie's been doing that for like a decade with Destiny games. They have value in being able to tap into that to try to avoid making the mistakes that other people do when they get into live services that have led to them basically failing now that the market is a lot more competitive than it was when, Destiny first showed up. We're kind of already seeing that with the whole thing with factions getting delayed. Like, that might have saved Sony a lot of money from launching that and it kind of being a dud to maybe actually being like a decent success now when it gets reworked. So we've got like $70 billion that Microsoft's paying, and just how are they going to recoup that? Right, like Activision-Blizzard has like around $1.5 billion in profit the previous year. And obviously Game Pass was kind of the big thing. But like, how much exactly do they think Game Pass is going to grow from this acquisition? Right? Because we're kind of just starting to see the effects of the Bethesda acquisition like this year, and we haven't really seen the effects of those previous studio purchases either, like Obsidian and like Playground Games. Like, I know like Grounded and Psychonauts 2 came out already, but I don't know if that was really like the tipping point where a lot of people were subscribing to Game Pass for those. In a way, they were like the Fable reboot might. So even if you can like definitively say that this acquisition, specifically of Activision-Blizzard, added like another $1.5 billion in yearly profit, not revenue, and also like factoring in any effects of people just like playing these games on Game Pass instead of buying them would have on the profit for Activision-Blizzard moving forward if their games start going straight to Game Pass like day one. On average, maybe it's a little bit bigger 2 years from now, but it's gonna be a few years before stuff actually ends up going Game Pass actually have a meaningful effect anyway. So, yeah, $1.5 billion on average seems reasonable when you again exclude people that are buying Game Pass because of Bethesda games or stuff like that. That's still like $3 billion, which would mean it would take like 20 years plus for this to be worth it. But you really could even argue that's kind of too generous, right? Because part of the big revenue that Activision-Blizzard is getting is from their mobile games with King. But like, mobile games and casual gaming in general is like very sort of roller coastery in terms of like peaks and valleys, right? Like app is just huge, but then it kind of just dies out eventually. You've seen that with like, Senga basically being kind of irrelevant and getting sold, and like the Angry Birds developer, kind of the same thing, and the Pokemon Go people. Even like the Clash of Clans, and that had the benefit of actually kind of getting lightning to strike twice a little bit with like a well-timed spin-off. But even they, just not really doing anywhere near what they were at their peak and are just kind of slowly going down, even if they had like a slight pandemic bump. So there really isn't much reason to expect that like King is going to make even what they've been making recently, not too far off in the future. That's just kind of the story of mobile games. Just you do something, it's big, and then it just slowly peters out. And that's kind of something that's going to screw over Microsoft now. They bought, this company that's probably having its valuation inflated by King and the revenue that's been getting. And again, I feel like it's really worth emphasizing just how difficult it is really just to credit any future growth of Game Pass to Activision-Blizzard. Like, I know it's been a little stagnant recently, but again, that's kind of really because you're just starting to see things like Bethesda, and I guess next year with like Avowed, those previous studio purchases, how do you just say future growth is not from that? Like, you could do some like data science or data analysis or whatever and just say, oh, well, these people on Game Pass are primarily playing Activision games. But like, that's kind of not helpful because you kind of don't want that, really. Because if you have people on Game Pass that are basically just playing mainly Activision-Blizzard games, but that just means that if they were not on Game Pass, they would be buying Activision-Blizzard games. That's just kind of, a hit to Activision-Blizzard profits as a division because they aren't buying their games anymore, and just kind of moving it to Game Pass revenue. And then, they also were possibly buying those on the Xbox Live store, and now they're not doing that, so you're not making that revenue on that service. And they were probably paying for Xbox Live, but now they're just getting that through like Game Pass Ultimate. Like, that's not new money, you're just shifting cash around that would have gone to other divisions to Game Pass in this situation. I feel like they kind of really screwed up with the timing of this, because I feel like Starfield would have probably answered a lot of questions about Game Pass. Right, like they probably have like the internal estimates of like how big of an issue people just like buying a month or two of Game Pass for like $10-20, or I guess 11 and 22 now, instead of like paying full price for the game, might impact their profit. And they had an opportunity with this release to make sure that they're right, and then like adjust their plans accordingly. But they didn't do that. They rushed to buy like a $70 billion company, basically like toppling down, I guess, wherever like the 9X version of that is, with this deal, before actually seeing if like this strategy of buying something just to move its games to Game Pass actually was a good idea with Bethesda. So now they've opened themselves up to a situation where if they look at this in like December and are like, oh, well, game sales took hit, but we were expecting that as Game Pass. Oh, wait, a lot of people just like canceled the Game Pass after like 2 months. Oh, we're screwed because we bought a different company for $70 billion on the assumption that these people would stay after getting sucked in for something like Starfield. I'm not necessarily saying that that's definitely going to happen, but they opened themselves up to that possibility because they just kind of rushed all these acquisitions basically back to back without making sure, yes, this does actually notably increase Game Pass profit for like the long term. I mean, it's worth mentioning that Microsoft has been kind of bad with estimates related to Game Pass before, like their whole growth numbers constantly being missed thing. So again, it would probably be smart to double check things that you're right with your internal numbers before you really dive the way that they have, but they didn't do that. And it doesn't even seem like console sales, like driving console sales, is really that big of a thing, because they've made it pretty clear with stuff like the PC releases that they're kind of really more interested in just getting, software and services going and not really necessarily doing everything they can to push console sales. And, because a lot of Activision-Blizzard King's revenue is tied up in things like WoW and mobile games, this isn't really even that great of an acquisition to drive console sales, especially now that whole like Call of Duty deal was ironed out where it's still going to PlayStation, which just kind of leaves like what, Crash Bandicoot or whatever as a console exclusive. I mean, I assume Blizzard isn't really going to do that much in like the near future in general, just because they have all these recently released live services that they're probably going to focus on for a while. And again, because they're live services, it's not really worth, exclusivity, because you're just kind of cutting out your potential audience for these microtransactions and kind of risking, the player base kind of drying out. Like you want a large number of people to play these kind of like multiplayer live service stuff to kind of just keep the game going. That's why Sony is, starting to do their live services stuff day one on PC, which is weird for them. But I do have some theories. None of them I think are particularly 100% perfect explanations and likely what is going through their head, but I think there's some reason to think about it. First, bear with me, because it's not necessarily something I think a lot of people want to hear, but I think it's worth talking about. Partially just because Microsoft talks about it, but cloud. Like, I know it didn't really work out the way people were talking about it in like 2010, but look at that like first kind of block in the UK. That was about cloud. And they might have done that just because, again, people like Microsoft were talking it up like crazy with the whole like, Amazon, Google are our competition, not PlayStation thing. I mean, you go back and look at the original announcement, and it just has outright mentions of gaming business across mobile, PC, console, and cloud. Use the phrase like across every device that really do make it sound like cloud was on the mind. Then those leaks came out, and there's just cloud stuff everywhere. And yeah, a lot of that stuff isn't like, from last week. A lot of it's from like a year plus ago. But at least in my mind, people like Microsoft really hyped that up again in like 2020, and then it didn't pan out and kind of seemingly abandoned it. Or at least just kind of, stopped talking about it and just started focusing on other things like Game Pass again. But I think those leaks kind of show that, like, no, they still kind of think cloud is a big deal. They just kind of think, okay, well, maybe it just needs like a couple more years. And then, in 2025 or whatever, it'll start getting, the ball rolling, really. So I think they still think that cloud is a big deal. And I can understand why, because even if there's issues really getting consumer on board, it just really makes so much sense. But like console sales haven't really grown that much since like the PS2 set that record. I don't mean like comparing console to console, but just like in general, that generation with like the last. It's been decently stagnant on that front, and mobile gaming is a big thing, so trying to get people into mobile games or just like light laptop gaming or whatever on like a cloud service to get them exposed to your games is just so much possible money that they just like can't give up on this idea. So, buying this stuff now when, cloud services aren't really a thing, and when that market of like mobile gamers that might get into cloud games is untapped, might just be what they think. But the biggest thing, I think, is mobile, but not in the way people are thinking about it in terms of like games. I'm thinking of a store, because there's a lot of tension kind of recently, not too recent, but like a little while ago, closer when this deal just started going through, about possible action against like Apple's monopoly with the App Store. The App Store makes a pretty decent amount of money. Like there's no competition. They can basically just charge that percentage and just make money off just everything that goes on. And then, deals with people like, Netflix that just have like these free apps that don't necessarily make that much money like directly. And if that actually happens, that could be a pretty big deal if someone, like Microsoft swoops in to, make their own store. Even just really on Android. Android's like a huge market too, so just doing that and actually getting people on there instead of the Google store could have a lot of value. But how would they do that, right? Because obviously, King is a thing. There are also the Bethesda games, if they're still interested in doing those. I think it was pretty smart with Fallout Shelter coming out right before Fallout 4. It was a pretty good way to both build and capitalize on hype for the main game. But would that really be enough to like get people to go to a different app store? Well, no, but Microsoft has its own apps, like Microsoft Office. Like that's kind of a big thing. The whole corporate world, that software is still basically king. Just having like, compatibility with like your phone on like a software level, and your work is very valuable to a decent number of people. So, the combination of these big games that people have for fun and the software people use for work can be pretty tempting to just get people onto these stores and basically just start printing money from just not having to pay whatever subscription to Apple and Google, and making that off of other people once that app store gets decently popular is a pretty big incentive, right? Like, especially since this kind of like easy service money is like really what like investors are into nowadays, and that whole cloud thing kind of plays into this too a little bit, right? Because there was that whole weird fight of like Apple doesn't really kind of like these subscription things. Like there was that fight with like Twitter with their subscription stuff. So I think I was reading like the cloud thing is technically a web app. It's like a weird workaround on iPhones. Like Microsoft's cloud thing isn't really an app technically. So getting around that, having the cloud stuff in something they can control is also good. I think this is probably the most likely thing, like I said, just because again this moneymaker is just a big thing. It's getting this percentage, and also ads. Like their own ad network, they've gotten a taste of that like ad revenue that's basically kept Google afloat with Bing. So expanding that might be something they're very interested in doing. If you think about this, is kind of explain how Microsoft okayed this, because it would be kind of weird if Xbox just went to them and was like, hey, give us $68 billion so we can buy a game studio. But if the pitch was, hey, we can make money this way and you can make money from this store, kind of makes a lot more sense why Microsoft was okay with spending the money. Like they got something for themselves with a new revenue stream. Now the third thing, again, not super convinced, but it's possible. Microsoft might just be stupid. Not stupid. Stupid isn't really the best word. Naively optimistic is kind of a better description, I think. Because it's worth remembering that this deal for Activision-Blizzard kind of started before a bunch of whole like entertainment subscription services kind of really started running into trouble in like 2022. Like the whole thing about like, oh no, Netflix is losing subscribers for the first time and their stock like plummeting. And then Disney Plus, again, losing numbers. I think that was a little bit later. Still, Peacock completely has struggled to find an audience. Spotify somehow still isn't profitable, even though it's been a thing for like 15 years. And it feels like they have a decent money-making model with like subscription and ads or whatever, but apparently not. Like it's kind of obvious that there just isn't the money in subscription services, at least for entertainment, that people kind of thought there were in like 2021 or like very early 2022. You're really just like completely overestimated the amount of people you could grab for these services. And there's some indication that kind of might be thinking about that and kind of preparing the situation where they might be getting a reality check, because they did this thing where they got rid of Xbox Live and just kind of made it a bottom tier of Game Pass. And a lot of people are kind of like, okay, why? Like there were some people who thought, oh, this is to get rid of like the monthly free games. But that kind of doesn't really make sense, because they're kind of just throwing like some random indie games on there. Like they probably weren't spending that much money on this, especially compared to like the $70 billion that they dropped. Like they're willing to spend some money, so I don't think like a small amount on like some indie game studios like that big of a deal. And they were also giving away like 25 games for this new bottom tier Xbox Live replacement thing. So they could have just given these games away if they really wanted to, because they're doing that now. So I think the reason they're doing this is because they really don't like how they've been having to go to investors and saying, yeah, Game Pass isn't making the money we said it was. Sorry. Yeah, we know we said the exact same thing a year ago. Our bad. So they're basically trying to hide that by just making it so Game Pass revenue, in quotes, is kind of just Game Pass plus what used to be Xbox Live. Right, like it's hidden now. There's no just straightforward number they're reporting of just Game Pass revenue. So they aren't saying, yeah, Game Pass isn't making the money it is supposed to be making. They're just saying, oh yeah, our services are underperforming. Game Pass is doing great. Trust us, basically. And no one can really check that, because, you know, yeah, maybe Game Pass is doing fine, but just this, like, new Xbox Live replacement thing just kind of isn't. You don't know. Journalists trying to look into it don't know. They can't know, because that's just not being reported anymore. Outside of this just one, just big Game Pass plus Xbox Live summary number. You know, like, again, they're basically just setting up to cover up not great Game Pass numbers, which seems odd if they're, you know, expecting things like Starfield and now all this, like, Activision-Blizzard stuff to definitely cause an explosion in Game Pass revenue. You know, like, if Game Pass is actually successful, then you'd think they would want to have these numbers to show off. The fourth thing is they could just get ready to be dicks, basically. Like, do basically whatever they can to really just make money abusing a kind of market position of them being Microsoft plus Bethesda plus Activision-Blizzard now. You know, like, I know there's kind of this perception going around of, like, oh, Xbox is, like, kind of pro-consumer, even though kind of not really, because they did the backwards compatibility, which was cool. Game Pass is cheap, but they kind of stopped doing that backwards compatibility and left a lot of stuff like Jet Set Radio just, like, unsupported. And now they're just, like, not even having the full games on the discs anymore, so if the servers go down in the future and you just can't play these games, you're already seeing kind of problems with, because, like, a lot of not that old Forza games are getting delisted because of just licensing issues, like, digitally, so you kind of need those discs, but that doesn't seem to be what they're doing now. Plus, you know, all, like, the microtransactions that were in, like, Horizons 5, like the gambling spin wheel things, and that's, you know, just recent. Like, obviously you have all, like, the Xbox One stuff that, you know, people are mad about, plus the whole you have to pay extra to get Starfield when it actually releases, or you have to wait like an extra 5 days or whatever it was. And I know that's kind of common, but it was kind of worse in this case because it was, like, Labor Day weekend, so it's kind of like FOMO of, like, oh, well, I have all this free time over this long weekend that I could be playing this game, so I kind of want to pay extra. And also, you know, it's just Microsoft in general. Like, go back to, like, the whole Raiders of the Silicon Valley era and, like, all the scummy stuff they did to, like, sabotage their competition, which ended up getting them a ton of lawsuits from the government, which did so much to really, like, change perception on Microsoft that the guy who basically prosecuted them, like, used his involvement in them to basically just jump into being, like, a Supreme Court judge. Actually, not even a Supreme Court judge, like, the Chief Justice. Like, they were the most important person in, like, the American justice system, basically. Like, that's how big of a deal these things against Microsoft were, even if they didn't all succeed. So I don't really have much reason to think they aren't going to abuse this position, you know, and there is kind of a lot they could do with, like, the dwindling number of publishers around, right? Like, Activision-Blizzard merger itself kind of involved, like, another publisher, and then, you know, a lot of their games ended up becoming Activision games that they had, like, publishing agreements with. But because there wasn't really that many people around when people like Bungie wanted to go off on their own, you need a big publisher. Activision was basically one of the few ones around, so they basically had to go to them. And, like, yeah, there's this, like, kind of newer, like, big publisher around that are buying up assets, but then a lot of things that they've bought haven't really gone that well, like Saints Row, and they're kind of being, like, iffy about funding and their actual finances now. So I wouldn't be surprised if we go into a potential, again, like most of these ideas, I don't think there's too much to this, but it's just, I think, a possible what they're thinking of to actually just get money off this huge deal. They could try to take advantage of the situation by doing things like really pressuring people who are really trying to get like a publishing deal and, like, actually get their games, like, funded. I should probably clarify again that since this is pretty negative of a statement around Microsoft, I don't really think this is super in the cards, but I think trying to pull some stuff if their original plans don't really go through is pretty reasonable. You know, they spend $70 million, they want some of that back. So trying to do some anti-competitive stuff, I think, is on the table. They did sort of say that they weren't going to make Bethesda games exclusive when they were buying ZeniMax. Like, the EU asked them, well, are you planning on doing that? And they were like, well, we have no incentive to do that. Just kind of an implied, no, we're not going to do that. and then they did, because they did have an incentive to do that. So, they haven't really been completely clean with this acquisition stuff. And there might be more unclean stuff to follow if, again, their original plans don't actually end up making them the money they were expecting.